Look, I haven't told a single soul this entire story face to face. Mostly because I didn't want people in Lawrence looking at me like I've completely lost my mind. But you know me well enough to know I don't scare easily. You know what I do for a living, down at the timber yards, cutting back old growth and clearing thick brush. So you know I spend my entire life surrounded by the quiet, heavy reality of the woods. But let me ask you something before I even get into the details. Have you ever been out in the deep woods and felt the entire forest just completely die out around you, as if every bird, insect, and breeze suddenly held its breath because something entirely wrong had just stepped into the timeline? Why did the local rangers at the edge of the county tell me, with dead serious eyes, to leave my truck keys directly in the ignition every single night I camped? What actually happens to your mind when you realize the towering shape tracking you through the fog isn't acting on wild animal instinct, but is actively calculating your next 3 moves before you even make them? And worst of all, why do you think I still hear the rhythmic, heavy huffing sound right outside my bedroom window on cloudy nights like this, long after escaping that godforsaken rage? You see, it all started back in mid-April, when the spring weather in Kansas was turning into that thick, oppressive grey gloom that settles deep into your bones. I had just finished rebuilding the top end of my old 1994 Ford F-250 diesel. You know how much time I spent tinkering with those old mechanical injection engines in my spare time, and I desperately needed a solid road trip to clear my head and test out the timing on those new fuel injectors. I decided to pack up a minimal amount of gear and head southeast toward Backwater Ridge, a brutal, densely packed limestone and pine ridge hidden deep within the old-growth borderlands of the Missouri Ozarks. It's roughly a 5.5 hour drive from Lawrence, making it the perfect distance for a solo weekend getaway where I could sleep in the back of the truck and just enjoy the raw, unmonitored isolation of the wilderness. By the time the big diesel engine rumbled past the rusted forgotten welcome sign of the backwater district, the sky had completely bruised over into a heavy twilight purple, choked out by low-hanging spring fog. The dampness in the air was thick enough to leave a slick sheen across the truck's windshield, forcing me to keep the wipers on a low, rhythmic click that felt incredibly lonely against the silence of the gravel roads. As a lumberjack, I can read a forest the way normal people read a morning newspaper. I know the difference between the natural, chaotic mess of healthy wilderness and the stagnant, oppressive weight of a place that's deeply unwelcoming. The trees along Backwater Ridge didn't look right. They were choked with thick, black rot near the bases, and their branches tangled together overhead like long, skeletal fingers, shutting out whatever dim light was left in the cloudy sky. I pulled the truck down an old, abandoned logging spur that I map-checked earlier, killing the heavy engine and letting the sudden, massive silence of the valley wash over the cab. I remember sitting there for a moment, just listening to the hot engine block tick and ping as it cooled down in the damp air, feeling a strange, creeping prickle of unease building up along the back of my neck. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the exhaustion of the long drive and the haunting quality of the Ozark mist twisting around the trunks of the massive pines. I grabbed my heavy-duty tactical flashlight and my favorite split hickory camp axe from the toolbox in the truck bed, setting up a small, temporary perimeter around the tailgate where I planned to cook a quick meal. A few years back, I watched a detailed documentary-style movie about old Midwestern folklore and the supposed encounters people had with the beast of Bray Road up in Wisconsin. But I always laughed it off as a Hollywood theatrics or overreactive imagination from city folks who don't understand how wild animals look in the dark. But when you live in the woods, you learn that every myth usually has a terrifying, bloody seed of truth buried deep beneath the folklore. Around 9 o'clock, the fog rolled down the ridge so fast it felt like a physical wall closing in around my campsite, dropping the visibility down to less than 15 feet in a matter of minutes. That's exactly when the woods went completely dead. The constant ambient drone of spring peepers and crickets in the nearby hollow just stopped instantly, cut off clean as if a master switch had been thrown in the dark. I stood frozen by the tailgate, holding my breath, my ears straining so hard against the silence that I could hear the steady, frantic thumping of my heart against my ribs. Then came the sound, a slow, deliberate snapping of heavy oak kindling out in the dark, followed by a low, dragging scrape that sounded precisely like thick, unclipped claws clicking lightly against the exposed limestone ledges. I raised the flashlight, sweeping the brilliant white beam through the soup-thick fog, watching the light scatter and bounce off the dense wall of moisture. About 20 feet out, right on the edge of the old logging path, the beam caught two massive, glowing amber points of reflection, reflecting back at me from about 7 feet off the ground. My breath caught solid in my throat, because those weren't the vacant, glassy eyes of a panicked deer or the wild, erratic glare of a rogue black bear. Those eyes were wide, chillingly steady, and burning with a terrifying, heavy intelligence that made my stomach drop into a cold vacuum. The silhouette behind those eyes began to shift, rising up fully onto two thick, backward jointed hind legs with a sickening wet sound of shifting muscle and popping joints. It didn't roar, it didn't growl, and it didn't rush me like a mindless beast driven by hunger. Instead, it did something infinitely worse that still makes my hands shake when I think about it. The creature slowly leaned its massive, wolf-like head to the side, narrowing its amber eyes as if it were studying my posture, evaluating the heavy camp axe in my right hand, and literally measuring my level of sheer terror. The sheer scale of the entity was staggering, dense, matted charcoal gray fur coat covering a chest that looked as wide as a refrigerator, with long, human-like arms that ended in massive, five-fingered hands, tipped with curved black daggers. It let out a low, slow exhalation through its long, elongated snout, a sound that sounded almost like a cynical, mocking sigh, letting me know, without a shadow of a doubt, that it wasn't afraid of the light, the axe, or me. For what felt like an eternity, we just stood there, locked in a horrific, silent standoff in the middle of the misty spring woods. The creature, observing me with the cool, calculating patience of a seasoned hunter, who knows his prey has absolutely nowhere left to run. My hand was practically glued to the handle of that camp axe, the cold steel of the toolhead offering zero comfort against something that clearly didn't care about standard weapons. I didn't break eye contact. Never break eye contact with an apex predator. That's rule number 1. As I slowly reached sideways with my left hand, groping blindly for the handle of the truck door. The creature didn't spring forward, it just stood perfectly still, watching my desperate movements with a sickening, amused expression. Its heavy chest rising and falling in perfect rhythmic sync with the swirling fog. The moment my fingers finally wrapped around the cold metal of the door handle and pulled, the click of the latch echoed like a gunshot in the dead quiet, and that massive entity instantly vanished into the grey soup without making a single sound. I threw myself backwards into the cab, slammed the heavy door shut, and locked it so hard I thought the plastic security knob would snap off right in my hand. My heart was hammering against my ribs, and my hands were shaking so violently I could barely guide the heavy steel key into the F-250's ignition slot. When the big 7.3-liter diesel engine finally roared to life, the loud mechanical rattle felt like a protective barrier between me and the darkness. But that illusion of safety didn't last more than 30 seconds. I threw the truck into reverse, intending to back all the way out of that narrow logging spur and hit the main highway. But as the bright reverse lights cut through the thick mist behind me, they illuminated a massive fallen white oak trunk, blocking the path completely. It hadn't been there when I drove in 20 minutes ago. The clean, jagged splinters at the fresh brake showed it had been snapped and dragged across the dirt road within the last few minutes by something with unimaginable physical strength. Suddenly a frantic, desperate pounding rattled the passenger side window, making me scream out loud and instinctively swing my camp axe toward the glass before I realized it was a terrified human face pressed against the window. It was a guy named Miller, a local conservation officer who looked completely unraveled, his heavy uniform torn to shreds and his face covered in deep, bleeding briar scratches. I unlocked the door and he tumbled into the cab, gasping for air, clutching a heavy-duty Remington 870 shotgun against his chest with white-knuckled desperation. "We can't drive out. The main creek bridge down the ridge road is completely washed out, and whatever is hunting out there just smashed my cruiser's engine block apart." Miller stammered, his voice cracking with a terrifying blend of panic and absolute certainty. He looked at me, seeing my Lawrence, Kansas tags and the professional logging tools in my truck bed, and realized we were both caught in the exact same life or death trap. "We have to make a choice right now," Miller said, forcing himself to breathe as he checked the brass beads of the shells in his shotgun magazine. "The old Forrest watch station is a quarter-mile up this ridge. It's built out of reinforced cinder blocks and has a heavy steel security door. So if we can fortify it, we just have to choose to hold out until the morning light cuts through this fog at 6 a.m. I looked back at the fallen tree, then out into the swirling grey mist where I knew those highly intelligent amber eyes were watching us calculate our choices. We chose to make our stand at the watch station, knowing that trying to clear that heavy oak log with my chainsaw in the pitch black would just make us sitting ducks for a creature that could outthink us. I shifted the truck into four-wheel drive, stomped on the gas pedal and forced the heavy F-250 up the steep, muddy incline toward the watch station, the tire spinning and throwing thick chunks of Ozark clay into the air. We didn't even make it halfway up the ridge trail before our second encounter began. At this time, there was absolutely nothing passive about the creature's strategy. Without a single warning sound, a massive dark shape launched itself directly out of the high pine tree line, dropping through the foggy air like a falling boulder. The creature slammed directly onto the hood of my truck with a deafening metallic crunch that completely caved in the heavy steel and shattered the passenger side headlight into 1,000 flying shards. The sheer impact force of the slam was so violent, it instantly blew out both front airbags and sent the heavy truck skidding sideways off the muddy path, pinning my driver's side door firmly against the thick, unyielding pine tree trunk. Through the cracked, spider-webbed windshield, I found myself staring directly into the snarling, terrifying face of the werewolf, its massive jaws snapping just inches away from the safety glass. The creature's hot, rancid breath fogged up the remaining glass, smelling of copper, decay, and old blood, while its yellow teeth scraped against the windshield with a sound that set my teeth on edge. It wasn't just trying to break in blindly, it was intentionally pinning us, using its massive weight to hold the truck down while it reached its long, clawed arms around the side to tear at the door's heels. "Shoot it, Miller! Shoot through the glass right now!" I screamed, struggling to untangle myself from the deflated airbag while my legs pinned me against the crushed floorboards. Miller didn't hesitate. He racked the heavy slide of the Remington and fired a deafening blast of 12-gauge buckshot directly through the front windshield. The blast was blinding in the cramped cab, showering us with a fine glass powder and filling the air with the sharp, acrid stench of burnt gunpowder. The heavy buckshot caught the creature squarely in its thick shoulder, forcing a hideous guttural screech out of its throat as it rolled off the crumpled hood and disappeared into the dark underbrush. "We have to move, now," Miller yelled, kicking his passenger door open, since my side was completely blocked by the massive pine tree. I grabbed my split hickory axe from the floorboards, scrambled over the center console, and tumbled out into the freezing wet mud right behind him, knowing we were now completely on foot. I'm telling you, running through those pitch-black Ozark woods, with the fog clinging to your skin like a wet shroud, is a type of terror I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. Every single root seemed to reach up to trip us, and every shadow looked exactly like that towering shape waiting to tear us apart. Miller was leading the way, his breath coming in ragged, whistling gasps, while I kept my split hickory axe raised, swinging my head wildly from side to side to catch any glint of amber eyes in the gloom. You have to understand, we weren't just running from a wild animal. We could literally hear it circling us in the dark, snapping branches first on our left, then instantly on our right, deliberately herding us toward the steep limestone cliffs at the edge of the ridge. It was calculating our speed, steering us like a seasoned sheepdog, showing a terrifying level of strategic intelligence that made my blood run completely cold. "Up there, look for the concrete steps," Miller yelled, his voice cracking as he stumbled over a hidden limestone ledge. Through a sudden break in the rolling fog, I saw the stark, ugly silhouette of the forestry watch station, its solid cinder block walls looking like a medieval fortress against the twisted pines. We scrambled up the steep embankment, our boots slipping frantically in the slick spring mud, and practically threw ourselves against the heavy steel security door. Miller grabbed the heavy iron handle, rattling it with white-knuckled desperation, but the deadbolt was firmly thrown from the other side. My heart instantly dropped into my shoes. If that door didn't open in the next 10 seconds, we were absolutely dead meat out in the open. "The lockbox! Check the windowsill!" Miller screamed, pointing a shaking finger toward a small, barred window to the right of the entryway. I didn't waste a heartbeat. I smashed the butt of my axe against the rusted metal lockbox, mounted beneath the sill, shattering the cheap plastic dial and exposing the heavy brass master key hidden inside. I snatched the key, jammed it into the main door lock, and twisted it with every ounce of strength I had left until the heavy iron deadbolt finally disengaged with a loud metallic clunk. We drove inside the pitch-black structure, slamming the thick steel door shut behind us just as a massive, heavy weight collided violently with the outside of the panel. The entire steel frame groaned under the sheer force of the impact, and the heavy iron slide bolt vibrated so violently it nearly jumped straight out of its track. Miller instantly threw his weight against the manual deadbolt, forcing the secondary steel bar deep into the reinforced concrete frame, locking us inside our makeshift tomb. For a solid 3 minutes, neither of us said a single word. We just lay there on the cold, dusty concrete floor, listening to the heavy, desperate sound of our own lungs fighting for air in the absolute dark. The air inside smelled strongly of old canvas, rodent droppings, and the stale metallic tank of rusted tools that had been abandoned for a decade. I clicked on my tactical flashlight, sweeping the beam around the small, single-room station to assess our defensive options. It was standard forestry design, solid cinder block walls, 3 small windows reinforced with thick, welded iron rebar grids, a heavy oak desk covered in ruined maps, and an old iron wood stove sitting cold in the far corner. In the back corner, I spotted an old mechanical workbench, which instantly made my gearhead instincts kick in as I scanned the rusty wrenches and heavy iron brackets scattered across the grease-stained wood. "We aren't safe in here, David," Miller whispered, his eyes wide and vacant as he sat propped against the steel door, his hands still trembling around the stock of his shotgun. "You don't understand what these things are. They don't just give up and walk away when they lose a trail. I've read the old county reports from the 70s. They map out their territory, they remember faces, and they will wait out a target for days if they have to." Right on cue, a horrifying rhythmic scraping sound started up directly above our heads, moving slowly across the corrugated tin roof of the watch station. The creature was pacing back and forth on the roof rafters, its heavy claws clinking sharply against the metal panels with a sound that felt like it was drilling directly into my skull. Then, the clicking stopped right above the central ventilation pipe, and the low guttural chittering sound vibrated down through the hollow metal flue. It was a sound of pure, mocking amusement. The monster was letting us know that it knew exactly where we were hiding and that our concrete fortress was nothing more than a cage. Suddenly the light in the room shifted as a heavy shadow blocked out the dim, foggy moonlight filtering through the southern window grid. I swung my flashlight beam toward the glass, and my breath caught as I saw a massive, fur-covered hand slide deliberately through the narrow space between the outer limestone frame and the iron rebar. It didn't try to rip the bars out with brute force. Instead, those long, human-like fingers began to systematically feel around the mounting brackets, testing the tension of the rusted anchor bolts. It was looking for a mechanical weakness, testing the engineering of our defenses with the cold, patient precision of a structural architect. "It's trying to unbolt the window grid from the outside," I muttered, my lumberjack instincts completely taking over as I realized the danger we were in. "Miller, give me those extra 12-gauge shells from your tactical vest right now." I ran over to the old mechanical workbench, grabbing a heavy pipe wrench and a handful of long, rusted iron spikes I found in a drawer. If that creature managed to clear those bars, we wouldn't have a prayer in this enclosed space, so I had to use my knowledge of structural leverage to reinforce the weak points before it figured out a way inside. I wedged the heavy iron spikes directly into the internal hinge mechanism of the window frames, hammering them deep into the brick joints using the flat side of my camp axe head. Just as I finished securing the second window, a deafening metallic snap echoed from the south wall as the creature successfully sheared off the top exterior anchor bolt with its terrifying jaw strength. The iron grid groaned, tilting outward by a couple of inches, and those intelligent amber eyes appeared in the gap, staring directly at me through the cracked glass pane. It let out a sharp, snapping bark that sounded horribly like a human being trying to stifle a cough, and then it began to violently heave against the remaining bolts. Miller scrambled across the floor, raising his Remington 870, but before he could pull the trigger, the creature did something completely unexpected that caught both of us entirely off guard. It reached its long arm around the corner of the building and violently ripped the heavy external copper grounding wire clean off the main electrical junction box. Instantly, the old backup generator outside sputtered, choked on its fuel line, and died completely, plunging the entire ridge into a thick, suffocating darkness that swallowed up our remaining hope. When the generator cut out, the sudden darkness didn't just blind us, it felt like a heavy, physical weight dropping onto our chests. I could hear Miller's frantic, shallow breathing to my left, his boots shuffling against the gritty floor as he tried to reorient himself in the blackness. "David, I can't see a damn thing," he whispered, his voice trembling so hard his teeth were clicking together. I didn't answer right away because my ears were locked onto a terrifying new sound: the slow rhythmic creaking of the remaining iron rebar on the south window giving way. I clicked the button on my tactical flashlight, but the beam was noticeably weaker now, cutting a faint yellow path through the dust particles dancing in the air. The light landed directly on the window, just as the creature shoved its massive, fur-covered shoulder through the shattered glass pane, forcing the iron grid to scream as the final mounting bolts tore out of the cinder blocks. The sheer size of the beast's head filling that opening was suffocating, its upper lip peeled back to reveal long, saliva-slicked fangs that caught the dim light of my fading beam. Miller let out a primal yell and raised his shotgun, firing his second-to-last shell directly into the opening. The blast was blindingly bright in the enclosed concrete room, and the heavy buckshot tore into the creature's chest, forcing a wet, gurgling roar out of its throat. But this thing wasn't an ordinary animal driven off by pain. Its superior intelligence meant it understood that the weapon had to be cycled before it could fire again. Before Miller could even rack the slide to chamber his final round, a massive clawed arm shot through the broken window frame with impossible speed, catching him squarely across the chest. The force of the strike lifted Miller completely off his feet, sending him crashing hard into the old iron wood stove in the corner with a sickening metallic boom. The shotgun flew from his hands, skidding across the concrete floor and sliding directly under the heavy oak desk where neither of us could reach it. Miller groaned, curling into a defensive ball as dark blood began to soak through the front of his torn uniform. I was completely on my own now, standing between a wounded, highly intelligent apex predator and my unconscious friend, with nothing but my split hickory camp axe in my hands. The creature hauled its massive upper body through the ruined window frame, its heavy muscles bunching as it prepared to drop its full weight onto the floor. That's when my mechanical instincts kicked in, saving my life in a split second of pure desperation. On the corner of the mechanical workbench right next to me sat an old, dusty 1-gallon can of pressurized ether starting fluid, something forestry crews use to kickstart stubborn tractor engines in freezing weather. I dropped the axe, grabbed the heavy can with my left hand, and snatched a long brass welding torch striker from the tool tray with my right. As the werewolf cleared the window frame and planted its massive hind legs onto the floor, its amber eyes locked onto me with a chilling, triumphant glare. It opened its jaws wide to finish me, but I didn't flinch. Instead, I slammed my thumb down the high-pressure spray nozzle, unleashing a thick chemical mist of highly flammable ether directly into its face. In the exact same motion, I violently struck the brass striker, creating a brilliant cascading shower of white-hot sparks right in front of the chemical stream. A massive, roaring column of bright blue and orange flame erupted from my hands, engulfing the creature's entire head and upper torso in a violent, high-velocity chemical fire. The reaction was instantaneous and horrifying. The creature let out a high-pitched, agonizing shriek that sounded terribly like a human child screaming in absolute agony as the intense heat scorched its sensitive eyes and matted gray fur. It stumbled backward blindly, thrashing its massive arms wildly in the air, smashing the heavy oak desk into kindling as it tried to escape the searing pain. Knowing I only had a few seconds before the flammable liquid burned off, I grabbed my split hickory axe from the floor, swung it with every ounce of lumberjack muscle I possessed, and buried the heavy steel head deep into the creature's exposed shoulder joint. The heavy impact severed thick muscle fibers, forcing another guttural scream from the beast as it collapsed sideways against the concrete wall. Instead of pressing its advantage, the creature's brilliant tactical mind realized it was severely compromised. It was blinded, badly burned, and deeply wounded in a confined space. With a final, desperate surge of physical power, it threw itself backward out of the ruined window frame, tumbling into the foggy darkness outside. I ran to the window, my hands shaking violently as I slammed the remaining iron bars across the opening, securing them with a heavy pipe wrench. I rushed over to Miller, dragging his limp body behind the heavy workbench and binding his chest wounds with strips of canvas torn from an old gear bag. We sat there in the terrifying silence for the next 2 hours, holding our breath every time the wind rustled the pine branches outside, wondering if the beast would figure out a way to retaliate. But it never came back that night. When the first dim grey light of dawn finally filtered through the heavy spring fog at precisely 6 a.m., the forest around the station remained dead quiet. I managed to help Miller walk down the ridge trail, avoiding my crushed Ford truck and bypassing the washed-out creek bridge by crossing a narrow limestone ledge on foot. We walked 3 miles down the county highway before a passing state trooper found us, covered in dried blood, soot, and pure exhaustion. Miller was hospitalized for 3 weeks with crushed ribs and deep lacerations, and when the official state report came out, the authorities blamed the entire incident on a rogue, rabid black bear. But Miller and I both know the terrifying truth. Black bears don't intentionally block roads by dragging heavy oak logs across them, and they certainly don't systematically unbolt iron security grids to get to their prey. I'm back home in Lawrence now, working the timber yards again, but I haven't been the same since that night in Backwater Ridge. Because every time the spring weather turns cloudy and the low fog rolls across the fields, I sit up in my bed, staring at my bedroom window. And last night, right around midnight, I heard it clear as day, a slow, heavy rhythmic huffing sound coming from the dark shadow of the trees at the edge of my yard, accompanied by the distinct light clicking of thick claws against the concrete driveway. It didn't lose my trail, man. It just chose to wait for the perfect moment to finish what it started.